I will never come back to the UK. I don't see a world where I can bring my kid to the UK and my wife.
The UK's racist. We're coming home. Meghan Markle, the UK tabloids were horrible to me, but guess what? I'm going to be their neighbor again.
An Associated Press asked Harry at a veterans roundtable in Washington, and he gave them 3 words: nothing to say.
And now we see that that is exactly what has come to pass. They've gone ahead and abandoned this excuse of security and paparazzi intrusion and are going back to the UK.
In 2022, Meghan Markle looked at the idea of a British school run and called it intolerable. Too many cameras, too much press, incompatible, she said, with keeping her own children safe. This month, the Associated Press reported that those same children may be starting school in Britain in September. So which is it?
But this has had to be in the planning for a very, very, very long time, and to get a property in time for the children's term dates in September.
There's probably more things that we don't know about this return than we do know. We don't know the schools that the children are going to. We don't know how long they're going to be here for. We don't even know where they're going to live.
Either Britain was the threat she described, or the warning was never really about the threat. And here's the part that should worry her most. The famous line about 40 photographers was written by the journalist, not spoken by Meghan. Her real words were narrower, and narrower is far worse for her, because in the sentence she actually said out loud she made a British school run the test of whether she was a good mother. In August of 2022, Allison P. Davis published a long profile of Meghan Markle in The Cut. It was not a quick sit-down or a press statement. It was the kind of piece a subject grants access for, over time, with the writer in the room long enough to describe the furniture, and the conversation eventually turns to the future, to what raising children in Britain would actually have looked like. Davis sets that scene herself. She describes the machinery that gathers around a royal on an ordinary morning, the press pack, the lenses, a school run converted into a photo call, and in her telling it could mean something close to 40 photographers waiting at the gate. That is the number that traveled around the world. It sits in Davis's prose. It never sits inside Meghan's quotation marks, and that difference is the reason this story has been argued about for 4 years without anyone reading the sentence at the center of it. What Meghan actually said was shorter and far more damaging to her. "Sorry," she said, "I have a problem with that. That does not make me obsessed with privacy. That makes me a strong and good parent protecting my child." Those are her words, and you can hear exactly what happens inside them. A complaint about cameras and lenses goes in, and a verdict on character comes out. Not "I would find that difficult." Not "that seems excessive." Protecting my child. Good parent. Meghan chose that frame, and nobody put it in her mouth. Meghan never banned British schools. She did something smaller, and far worse for her. A ban would at least have been a position about schools. This was a position about herself. She took one morning's worth of photographers, and turned being unseen into the mark of a good mother. And the exaggeration has been doing Meghan a favor ever since. A profile gets written once. A line like that gets repeated 100 times, and every repetition sands off another edge. In the source, the worry is conditional and specific. It is about the press pen that would gather at one British school run, that scene, under those conditions, at that moment in their lives. Every retelling moves one step outward, and the condition starts to disappear. Hart framed it around not wanting her son at a British school at all. The fear of the cameras has quietly become a verdict on the schools themselves, as though the classrooms were the problem rather than the pavement outside them. LBC folded the same words into the Mandela press pack row, so the story became the fight rather than the fear behind it, and the original condition dropped out of view again. Then it lost its footing altogether. The following month, when the Cambridge children were starting a new school, ITV News reached back for the Meghan line and attributed it to a podcast, to something she had said on air when it had lived in a magazine profile all along. The wording had traveled so far from home that reporters could no longer say what kind of thing it originally was, let alone what it said. And that is the version that stuck. A woman who bans an entire country's schools for her child. It is a cartoon, and cartoons are easy. Easy to repeat. Easy to laugh at, and above all easy to dismiss, because anybody defending her could point at the 40 and say she never said it, which was perfectly true. So for 4 years the argument stayed parked on a number that came out of a journalist's typewriter, and the sentence underneath it was never read at all. The false version was so much louder than the real one that it drowned it. Meghan has been shielded by the exaggeration, not wounded by it. Because the real one is not a cartoon. It is a woman with one of the largest platforms on earth telling the world that the country her husband's family has served for 1,000 years cannot be trusted around a child, and offering that judgment as evidence of her own good character. Nobody laughs at that. Nobody dismisses it either. Which raises the only question that decides this. Strip the headlines back to her real narrower position, and does that position still collide with what is now being reported? The Telegraph broke it on the 19th of August. An extended British arrangement, a private and non-royal base, children educated in Britain from September. People published its own account the same day, Simon Perry describing the same extended stay, the same private base, the same British schooling, with homes kept elsewhere. Then the Associated Press, which does not chase things, went and stood the outline up as well. Nobody has confirmed it on the record. Nobody has denied it either. Asked about it directly, Harry said he had nothing to say, and representatives declined to comment. That silence is badly out of character. These are two people who have spent 6 years correcting the record about themselves in interviews, in a documentary series, and in a memoir, who have answered far smaller things than this within hours. Faced with a story on 3 mastheads about where their own children will spend the school year, the most documented couple of their generation suddenly had nothing to say. Nobody has walked a child through a British school gate yet, and the Sussexes could deny every word of this tomorrow. It would change nothing. The half of this that belongs to Meghan was never a school form or a September date. It was a sentence she chose to say, with her name on it, 4 years ago. And here is what turns that sentence from an exaggeration into something worse. The scene she described was never an open field. It was one of the most carefully protected pieces of ground in the country, and Britain had spent decades building that protection long before Meghan Markle ever arrived to complain about it. The school place is the first thing to fall apart, because the word everyone reaches for hides at least 5 different things. An application is not an offer. An offer is not an accepted place. An accepted place is not registration, and registration is not a child walking through the gate on a Monday morning in September. Department for Education guidance is explicit that a family moving from overseas can apply for a place and can even receive an offer before every part of that move is settled. So the very first thing the reporting describes, schooling from September, is a step the guidance itself treats as separate from the finished, settled life the warning imagined. Then the cameras, which were the actual substance of the fear. The scrum she painted descending on a child is not a free-for-all in British reporting. It runs straight into the press code. The editor's code enforced by IPSO answers her almost clause by clause. Clause 2 protects private and family life. Clause 3 on harassment orders journalists to stop photographing a person the moment they are asked to desist. And Clause 6 on children says in plain words that every pupil should be free to complete their time at school without unnecessary intrusion, and that no pupil may be photographed at school without permission from the school itself. That last clause sits right on top of her sentence. She described a press pen at the school gate as the reason a good mother could not raise her child in Britain. The regulator had already written the rule that forbids it.
And I think quite rightly on this respect when it comes to children, where the children get their privacy, get to have a normal life.
So people are very protective of the children. We don't see pictures of Prince George and Prince Louis at their sports events and sports games.
The courts sit on top of the regulator, and the case that matters here belongs to another famous mother. In Murray, the child photographed in the street was the young son of J.K. Rowling, caught in his buggy by a long lens on an Edinburgh morning and printed in a Sunday newspaper. The Court of Appeal held that the boy had a reasonable expectation of privacy, even out in public, precisely because he would never have been photographed had he not been the child of someone famous. That is the exact shield Meghan said Britain could not give her children, and Britain had already handed it to a novelist's little boy in a pram, years before she ever complained. And the working royals did not treat that shield as decoration. In 2015, William and Kate went to the press directly over the hunting of Prince George, and the tactics they described were not imagined. Photographers were working from parked cars with darkened windows, lying in wait for hours behind long lenses, monitoring the movements of household staff, even using other children as bait to draw the boy into open view. Their answer was not to announce from another continent that the country was unsafe for a child. It was to name the conduct, invoke the rules that already existed, and make the machinery do its job. Meghan was handed that same machinery, and she called it incompatible with being a good parent. And the ground under the school belongs to the school. A head teacher controls access to the premises, and government guidance backs that control, so a photographer has no right of entry and can be removed. Where the conduct becomes repeated, intimidating, or distressing, harassment law engages on top of everything else. That is a regulator, a court, a head teacher, and an act of parliament, all standing between a lens and a child, and every one of them was already in place on the day Meghan told a global magazine that a British school run was incompatible with protecting her own. Those rules do not make a camera disappear, they make it answerable, and answerable is a world away from the near certainty Meghan communicated. She looked at a country that had built one of the most protective regimes in the world around children and the press, and she described somewhere that does not exist. And there is a detail inside that same interview that gives the whole thing away. The writer who took down the 40 photographer line was with Meghan because she was doing the school run in California. Meghan collected Archie from his preschool with a journalist walking beside her, the ordinary pickup she had just called impossible in Britain, and she did it in the middle of the very profile where she called it impossible. The school run was never the danger. A version of it she could not stage manage was the danger. Meghan did the exact thing she called incompatible with good parenting, that same afternoon, for that same journalist, and the roof did not fall in. The only variables that changed were the postcode and who was holding the camera. What changed between then and now is hers to explain, and she has not explained it. That silence is why the line still has teeth. Years later. The early press treatment of Meghan could be genuinely brutal, and some of it crossed lines that should never have been crossed. Here is where she loses the argument. The complaint is intrusion, the unbearable weight of being watched. The answer has been to walk straight back into the light, over and over. The interviews, the documentary series, the memoir, the most intimate corners of their lives handed over in their own words, on their own platforms, on a schedule of their choosing. And every one of those releases does the same thing to the machine they say is hunting them. It feeds it. A documentary generates a year of coverage. A memoir generates 2. Each round of disclosure raises the market value of the next photograph of them, which is the currency the cameras run on. You cannot spend 6 years asking the world to look at you on your terms, and then treat every look you did not authorize as a violation of your peace. That is the trap privacy rhetoric builds, and Meghan built hers with her own hands. Turn privacy into a moral argument, into proof of what kind of parent you are, and you hand the world a standard and invite it to measure you against that standard forever. Every later choice then gets held up to the line, and when a plan surfaces that appears to walk back across it, the contradiction is not something the press manufactured. It was left lying there, loaded, by the woman who drew the line. Which is exactly what happened with the school run. Meghan did not merely express a worry, she minted a vivid, quotable line and bolted it to her identity as a good mother, and a line like that does not fade. It sits in the archive waiting for the day the reporting catches up with it. The reporting has caught up, and the 2 records now sit side by side. In 2022, in her own recorded words, Meghan framed the British press environment around a school run as incompatible with being a strong and good parent. In 2026, credible reporting says her children may be schooled in Britain this September. The contradiction was never in the headlines. It lives in the space between what she said and what is now reported. The ban was always a press invention, and handing it back does not weaken the case against her. It sharpens it, because what is left is the thing she actually did, in her own quoted words, with nobody else's fingerprints on it. The shape of the reported arrangement says the rest. A private house, not a royal residence. A school place, not a royal role. No title restored, no duty resumed, no obligation to anyone, no answering to the family or the institution she spent years describing as the problem. The country provides the schools, the codes, the courts, and the protection. Nothing is asked in return. That is what is actually on the table, and it tells you what the 2022 warning was really worth. Meghan took an ordinary, regulated press problem and turned it into a test of whether she was good enough to protect her child, with the answer already built into the question. She made protection a performance. She welded that performance to a line built to last, and left the line sitting in the record where anyone could find it, and the reported plan is simply the day it sprang. That is not a principle she lives by. That is an argument that fit the moment she needed it. And once the principle turns out to be disposable, so does everything she hung on it. Strong and good parent was never a fact about Meghan. It was the last line of an argument, and an argument gets dropped the moment it stops being useful. She did not spend 4 years shielding her child from a British school run. She spent 4 years using one as proof of her own character, and the reported plan is the receipt.